Happy Friday, everyone. I hope everyone had a great week. And we're going to go into talking about dimensions versus segments today, or segments versus dimensions, whichever you want to go with first. So again, I am Tanya Henderson, and I am with Test Team. And so what we're going to talk about, like I said, dimensions versus segments. And so we're going to kind of hop right over into the slide deck to see what we have today. So obviously dimensions versus segments. So we're talking about GP to BC. So just comparing the two products, there's a really, really big difference in between these two. So this is going to be definitely a really, really informational video. And so what we're going to start with is we're going to start with kind of, what is the setup comparison between these two? So obviously in GP, you're going to install the product. Business Central, you're really just kind of I guess configuring the tenant or installing the tenant, however you want to put that out. But when you do a GP installation, you actually, while you're doing the installation, you will choose what you want the segment structure to be. So as you're doing that, when whoever does the install, they have to choose the maximum length for the segmentation. So the maximum length, I believe, it's terrible that I can't remember this, but it should be, I think, 66 and 10 segments. So 66 characters or 10 segments. We don't like anybody to ever have 66 characters, but you never know. So that should be the max in GP. If somebody does not install it with that maximum, you could not actually use that maximum. So I think when I very first started the GP world a few years ago, I think my employer actually installed it with like 48 and 6 or something like that. And so when they did that, obviously if I wanted 10 segments, I would have never been able to have 10 segments unless you used one of the third-party products to actually do the changing of the segments, which is really reinstalling the product. You can't actually change that in the system once it's installed. So yeah, kind of a big deal. So that's why a lot of times I used to do installations many, many years ago. So when I did those installations, I would almost always do it at 66 characters and 10 segments, just to make sure that if anybody really needed that segmentation, that they would have that there. So GP, you do it during the installation. Business Central, there's really nothing that you do. You're just essentially, the tenant is there and you'll make that decision as to what you choose when you're actually setting up the chart of accounts. So in GP, once you do that install, you of course go through and do the account format. So when I'm doing the account format, that's when I kind of choose what I want my structure on my segmentation on the accounts. So if we're talking about, segments, and this is one of the very first things when I'm doing demos, I always teach people this. I go through and say, okay, the big difference between GP and BC and the financial area is this segmentation versus the dimensions. So if any of you have ever been on MDA or analytical accounting, that's kind of the dimensional thought process that you go through for that. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a heads up if you've used one of those products. If you haven't, no big deal. Obviously, we teach you kind of how to understand what the difference between those two are. So segments in GP, if I have a 3-segment chart of accounts, I would have maybe my division and my natural and a department. So those are 3 segments that you would have to have. So when you do that and you create a new account, you don't have to fill out all the segments, but most people do, because if you don't, the sorting and everything can be really, really off on that. So most of the time people would go through and they would do like 000 main account 00 if it was like a balance sheet account. So you kind of pre-filled the segments with 0, and then for every single account or every single department, you had to have a different account. That's a lot of accounts. We've had some customers who had like 10,000 accounts in GP, And when we put them on Business Central, they ended up with 3,000 accounts, which is a really big difference. Of course, they end up with dimensions and dimension values, but they still only have that main account now. And so, like I said, that's kind of the biggest difference. So on the Business Central side, we now have what we would call the dimensions. So a dimension would be just like a segment. It'd be a department. A dimension value would be the values that make up that dimension, which could be, if it was a department, maybe HR, general, maybe it's just a general admin, something like that, IT department, sales department, and so on. Now, in Business Central, there are 8 different dimensions available. And then, of course, your dimension values are basically unlimited. Then you have another option, which are called dimension combinations. So those dimension combinations allow you to combine, I'll say combine dimensions or restrict or block. I should say block is what Business Central uses. So it allows you to block those dimensions so that if this particular department doesn't belong with a particular location or division, then I can say that that dimension is blocked. So that if anyone tried to go in and do a journal entry or a payable to this division and this department, it would come up and say, this combination is not allowed, which is really kind of cool because in GP, we had to create there wouldn't have been an account available, and it would have come up and said, hey, this account doesn't exist if you attempted it. Do you want to add it? In Business Central, it comes up and says, hey, this combination doesn't work. So if you had certain, accounts and divisions that don't work together, you would just do combinations on those or do the combination setup for those. And then basically you would be able to block those, which is kind of a really cool little feature. So you will also have in Business Central, when you're setting up things, you will have what is called the general ledger setup, which is kind of like the account format inside of GP. It's where you tell it what is your global dimension 1, 2, or your shortcut dimension 1 through 8. So that's when you'll do that setup. And then, of course, you'll sign the global dimensions 1 and 2. That's what you see all over Business Central for reporting purposes. So kind of just this is the overall setup comparison of the two products, okay? So now let's talk about the master data comparison of the products. So in GP, we of course have a chart of counts, which is the full segment there. And there's a category inside of GP, which some people have never used, but it's actually very functional. And I've always had my customers use it. So on that category, it might be called cash, it might be called accounts receivable, intangible assets, whatever it's called. There are 48 of them inside of GP out of the box, and then you can add additional categories in there. What that allows you to do is it allows you to then on your financials, like maybe inside of advanced financials, it absolutely uses them. But inside of management reporter, you could actually print a line or a row by that category. Another place that I use it a lot of times was in the smart list. So if I said, hey, show me all my sales accounts, I could easily pull a smart list to show me just the accounts that were associated with the sales category. So, and then of course I could put notes on those particular accounts if I wanted to, the little yellow notepad inside of GP. So as far as the master configuration, of course there's some user-defined fields and things like that that you can use on your account setup. What type of account is it and all of that. You have the exact same functionality inside of Business Central as well. So on the BC side, of course, I have my chart of accounts, okay? The big difference here, though, it's not the full segment. It is just the natural account. So if I look in BC and I look at the accounts, all I will see is the natural account number, okay? And then when I create that natural account number, I could default some dimensions on that if I wanted to. Maybe that's the only things that go with that. And I will give it a category, which there are 5, maybe 6 categories, depending on different things I've seen. So it's like your assets, your liabilities, your equity, your cost of goods sold, and your expenses. And sometimes I think there was a totaling category I think I've seen in the past. I think I actually did a tweet about it or something. So you create an account, you assign a category to it, and then you assign a subcategory. Now, my categories, I can't add additional categories. My subcategories, on the other hand, I can add additional categories. So if I was comparing the two products, my category in GP is equal to my subcategory in Business Central. So I can create those subcategories that will actually drive my account schedules or my account schedule. So, my account schedules are my list of my account schedules. So when I get into that account schedule, I can drive it from there. So just kind of a little bit of information on how those work. Those are extremely important. So if you're ever wanting to migrate from GP into Business Central and you don't have those categories set, I honestly tell people go in, get those categories set up in there, so you kind of have a little bit of a jump in the game, because when you get to Business Central, it is very important. And so you're going to assign them at some point. So if you thought about it before you move, you kind of have a little bit of a leg up on the game. So that's kind of a little bit of information. You will still have, of course, your account types. Again, I can assign dimensions to those or default dimensions to those particular areas. I will also have, like I said, I will have totaling or heading different account types inside of Business Central. And this is one of the things that I think is actually really kind of cool, because you don't have this in GP at all. I have seen it in other systems. So I can create an account, like maybe a 1,000 account, and I would say this is my assets. And maybe 1,001 is my cash account. So I can create that account and say maybe it's a beginning total. Then I would create my accounts, 1002, 1003, and so on. That are my cash accounts. And then I can get down to maybe the 1999, and I could say this is the ending total. So whenever you're in the chart of accounts, it will actually show you the totals right there on the screen. So it's like almost being able to see your balance sheet, like real time. And you can drill down on that, and you can get into being able to actually see what's in those accounts, and it'll show you the ledgers there. So kind of a really cool feature. And then, of course, I also have notes available, so I can make comments, on that particular account if you so need that. Okay. So now I do have my drill down comparison. So in GP, if I'm on my account, or my master account card, I will have a summary button. So I can click on the summary button and it will bring up the inquiry. So essentially anything that has gone to that particular account. I believe I also have a history button there. If it's depending on the version, you'll have a history button. So that history button will also take you to the inquiry history windows. If you're on some of the older versions, the newer versions have actually combined those inquiry windows so that there's a radio button to say current or history. And then, of course, there's also an analysis button, which gives you an analysis view. So if you've created any analysis views in GP where you can combine accounts together and just basically see the totaling of those accounts, that's what I would see in that view. And you kind of have the same thing inside of Business Central. You'll have some analysis views as well. I don't have that on this slide, but that is also available. But I will have inside of Business Central, I will have a balance and then a balance by dimension. So if I wanted to click on the balance, again, I would be able to drill down and see what makes up the balance. And then balance by dimension would, of course, take me to the dimension level and show me what balances I have by dimension. And that would be, of course, any transactions that I've posted to a particular dimension. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through the high level of everything, let's go ahead and just go into a demo of Business Central and GP. So I'm going to head over here to my laptop and we will get started. So here is Business Central, and I'm going to pull up GP as well. So here in GP, this is where I want to kind of just go into that area that I was talking about. Most customers are not installing GP by themselves. So somebody will go through and, set this up for them. But this is where we're talking about that account format. And if you ever go into this when everybody's inside of GP, then you won't be able to, it'll bring up an error message or a window that says somebody's, there are people logged in, you can't change the account schedules. So, or account format, I should say. The account format also, you can change this after the fact, as long as you are making it smaller, not bigger. Now, this is not something that you just kind of on a whim do. This would be something where you'd want to have multiple backups. You'd want to do it over a weekend. You'd want to run your check links and your reconciles and all that stuff if you ever made a change to this, because it can really kind of, mess with your data. So in this particular window, this is where you will see that we have the division, account, and department. So mine right now is a 66 and 10, because like I said, that's what I usually install, and I installed this particular version. I have my account length set up as 9 and 3. So it's 3 segments with a max characters of 9. So I have a 342 option on my segmentation. Okay. And you can see that those are named, and you can also see down at the bottom that my main account segment is actually set up to be the account. Okay. So that would be what you would have inside of BC for basically setting up that account structure. And that's really kind of all you have to do for that. Then you'll get into, of course, setting up your accounts. So here I would have an account, and this is my MasterCard for my accounts, and I'll just bring up the accounts payable account. So now you can see on the accounts payable account, I do have this padded with zeros on both sides. It's a balance sheet account, but my main account is that 2210. If I was to migrate over to Business Central, my account would become 2210, and those 2 segments would basically fall off and possibly become dimensions. Okay, so here I have my posting type, of course, what it is, which is very important in GP, by the way. That posting type drives when you close your year, whether or not that gets closed to the balance sheet or it rolls forward. A balance sheet account rolls forward, a P&L account rolls up to your retained earnings. So very important. One of the things before you close your year, that's what I always tell people, that is one of the most important things that you always look at. Now, the account category that we were talking about right here, where I said there's 48 of those out of the box, this is where you can add those additional categories. So in the category area here, we can see that these are kind of some of the different categories that are available. And of course, you assign that to your accounts. Again, if you haven't migrated and you're going to be getting data out of GP to go to BC, I go ahead and tell people to do this because you might as well do it in the system that you're in, and it doesn't hurt anything anyway. So of course, notes field here, a couple other fields that are available, user defined. This is where I was talking about your summary. Forgot about the budget button, but there is a budget button here which can show me the budget for this particular account. And of course, if you're using multi-currency, you would see that there too. But here's the analysis. If I had any analysis groups in here, which I probably don't, but this is where I would see the analysis groups, and I would be able to see a little more information about that. So that's kind of my setup for the GP side, and I'll go ahead and just save that. Now, if I hop over into Business Central and I look at my chart of accounts, if I go into my chart of accounts here, this is where you will see that now I just have an account. Okay. So main piece of area, I don't say what is what one's an account. I don't do any of that. I just import my accounts. Now, where we get to kind of the little more important part, this is where I would need to set up those dimensions. And I can go over to my lookup, and I can go ahead and go in and put in my dimensions. And you'll see that I have dimensions combinations, and I'll get to the values screen from the dimension window. So if I click on dimensions, this is where I have my dimension set up. Like I said, I can have 8 of those. I've been told you could have more of those, but in the system, you only see 8. So if more are available in the back end, I'm not sure about that. Might have somebody kind of comment on this and say something. But this area right here, I have not had anybody have more than 8. I have had somebody have up to 6, which is a lot, because I don't think I have anybody really in GP that has 6 segments, possibly, but most people have 2, 3 segments. Some have 4. So I've had a couple of customers that have definitely had 4 to 5 inside of BC. So here, these are my dimensions. And then if I wanted to click on and see the dimension values, I can go up to dimension, and then that's where I could go up and say, these are the values that are associated with this dimension. Now, I can obviously add these at any time. I can block these. I could make these just a standard dimension. I could also make it beginning and heading and total rows inside of my dimension values, just like I could, like I said, in the chart of accounts. And I can also block these so that if I no longer use a dimension, I could block them. So there are quite a few other features. As you can see, there's, account type, default dimensions, and so on. I'm not going to talk about any of those because I'm really just kind of trying to compare this to GP in just the, kind of the chart of accounts dimensions area. So these are those dimensions. And then, of course, I can go in after I create my dimensions. I would go into my general ledger setup. Okay. Oops, I got to type a few more letters there to get into that. Oops, I'm going to probably have to type. Oh, nope, there it is. So one of the very cool features, if you don't know where it is, easy way to get to it is always just using your, I think, find me, search, whatever you want to call it. I usually call it something different, the magnifying glass, because there's a search feature at the top of a lot of windows. So if you come into this window and we look down here at dimensions now, this you will see I have a global dimension 1 and 2, and I have a shortcut dimension 1 and 2. So those are the same. So the global dimension 1 equals shortcut dimension 1 and 2 equals 2. Okay. So when I add those dimensions, which is what I have to do first, then I can assign the hierarchy of what order these would go in. So I create that dimension, assign the hierarchy. So when I want to you'll notice that you can't actually do any kind of lookup here like I can on shortcut dimension 3 through 8. So I do have to go up to general, and I have to go in and say change the global dimension. So this is where I would assign those global dimensions. I would go ahead and start that. And then now if I came back to this window, I would see that shortcut dimension 1 and 2 are now both set as well. So that's all I have to do. Create my dimensions, create my dimension values. I don't have to do that before I do this, but the values are important. And then assign them in the general ledger setup. Now, if I wanted to do those dimension combinations that we were talking about, I'm going to go back in here and go to my fingers are in the wrong spot. It's late on a Friday already. Oh my goodness. Guess I'll have to look at my screen look at my keyboard for a second. I should tell the guys I actually do have keys on my keyboard. We had a session yesterday, and the guys were saying that they didn't have any letters on their keys, and I'm like, I don't know what I would do. Not that I look all the time, but it can be kind of fun. So here's my dimension combinations. So if I look at my dimension combinations here, you will notice that I'm going to go ahead and make that a little bit bigger too. So I have a lot of dimensions in this particular test company, but you can see here that there's nothing really blocked on these. You can also have it show the name, the column name. So if I change that, it would just change the column name if I had 000 and that was equal to company. Mine are pretty much the same. So here though, you'll notice if I'm on company and company, if I click this, which I am clicking it, it doesn't do anything. But if I come over to company and maybe department, you'll notice that it pops it up and it says no limitations, limited, or blocked. So if I want to say that it's limited, I would choose limited, hit OK. It'll open this little, basically it puts the word limited in there. And now I can click on limited and it'll ask me if I want to see the values. Of course, I would say yes. And now I can see those values. And this is where I could go through and block certain things in here so that that particular company will not work with a division. Okay. So that gives you kind of a, kind of a really big difference between GPs financials, and Business Central. And so here, again, this is my account. If I want to open that particular account, you can see here I have the category, which I said there's 5 or 6 categories in there. And then you have your subcategory, which again, this is like my category in GP. I will only see the subcategories that actually tie to the category. So I won't see my entire list. I will only see the ones that kind of go with the category, which is really kind of cool too, because then I can't assign something that might be incorrect. So that gives you kind of, just a really high overview of your accounts. And of course I can block these. I can have direct posting. So you can see there's a lot of different. If you compare GP's account card with Business Central's account card, there's definitely a lot more that is on this particular window. And then, of course, I can drill down to my ledger entries. I can look at comments. I can do the default dimensions. If I'm looking at extended text, where is this account used? So if I've done setups in the posting accounts, I can see kind of where those are used, which is really kind of cool because you don't really have that in GP. And then, of course, my balance, as I was saying, on my slides, that I can see the GL balance or the GL balance, GL account balance, GL balance, and then a balance by dimension. And these will probably just take me to 2 different places. And if I go back out here, this is where I was saying where this screen, as I have those totaling rows, which is kind of cool, because now if I want to look at something that's in an account, I could actually just click on it and that will take me to the general ledger entries. And this is kind of everywhere inside of Business Central that you have ledger entries. So I can see if it was an invoice, it's a credit memo, what is it as a payment. And then from these screens too, I can go in and see what the actual entries are. So if it was a customer, I could go drill down to the customer. I can drill to the GL, back to the GL to see what accounts this particular entry, what other accounts this entry hit, and so on. So a lot of information in just a little bit of time, but that gives you kind of a really good overview of what is the difference between the GP account structure and the Business Central account structure. And so that is all I have for this evening. And so if you want to find me, this is where you would find me on Twitter, in my YouTube video, and I do have a blog. I haven't blogged recently about this stuff, but I do definitely, when things come up, I do put some blogs out there. So I hope you guys have a great evening, and thank you for joining me.